Hello, everybody. My name is Jessica Turton, and I am an accredited practicing dietitian. I manage a team of dietitians with Ellipse Health, and we work with individuals all over Australia. We practice something called medical nutrition therapy, which is a highly personalized way of developing dietary interventions and supplement plans. One of the things we find is that individuals do really well with some form of low carbohydrate approach, depending on what their goals are, their nutritional requirements, and their individual circumstances. I also am studying low carbohydrate diets at university. I'm at the tail end of my PhD, and I'm currently in the middle of conducting a clinical trial. And my clinical trial is looking at low carbohydrate diets in adults with type 1 diabetes. So quite a specific clinical population. But this presentation today is all about getting started with a low carb approach, no matter what your health goals or individual circumstances. So thank you, Tracy McBeath, for organizing this amazing event. I think it's a great idea to go back to basics and really just talk about how to get started with low carb, because I think we can, get stuck down rabbit holes when we read information online, and there's so much information out there to consume, and sometimes it can get a little bit overwhelming. And this is why I love events like this, but I also really encourage people to find a source of support that they really trust, and stick with one or two bits of information rather than trying to consume everything. So hopefully in this presentation, I can give you some tips for getting started on low carb. And if you're already doing low carb, maybe you can just bring things back to basics a little, make sure you're ticking all the foundations off. Because I think that the strategies we talk about in this presentation are going to be useful no matter where you are in your journey. Okay, so I always find at conferences, especially on low carb diets, there tends to be a lack of actually defining basic nutrition principles. So I always like to start with some Nutrition 101 just to make sure we're all on the same page. So macronutrients are nutrients in food that actually give us energy. So these are what our body uses to make our energy molecule, which is ATP, and that's how we function each day. All of our cells need lots and lots of energy every single day so that we can live our best lives, essentially. So the macronutrients are carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and alcohol. Just because we can use these nutrients for energy doesn't necessarily mean we should be doing that. Now, your body can only use one source of energy at a time. Now, if you draw your attention to alcohol, you're probably thinking, what? I didn't realize alcohol was a nutrient, but it is a macronutrient. It does give us energy. But I think we can all kind of see that running your body on alcohol as a source of energy for the majority of the time is probably not going to be very beneficial. Alcohol is a toxin, and it's something that your liver has to process. Yes, it can give you energy, but it also has a lot of negative consequences too. Protein, as you can see there too, protein is basically our body's building blocks. So we use proteins to form our muscles, connective tissue, skin, hormones, enzymes, bones, and much more. Protein is so valuable that we don't really want to be using protein for energy. Our body is really only going to break down protein or use protein for energy if we are in a state of starvation, whereby there is not enough other sources of energy available. So it is classed as a macronutrient, but it really shouldn't be considered a source of energy. So that really leaves us with carbohydrates and fats as two appropriate sources of energy. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that you have a choice. You can choose whether you want to use carbohydrates for energy or whether you want to use predominantly fats for energy. And I think in my clinic, most people coming in to see myself and my team of dietitians, they want to use fat because they're already using carbs. Their diet is already carb heavy and it's not working for them. So we really encourage people, or we teach people how to actually switch over to using fats as a source of energy. And there are a lot of benefits to doing so. But I guess what I will reiterate here is that your body can only use one source of fuel at a time. So you really have to make a choice. Do I want to be on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, or do I want to be on a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet? And of course, there's different ratios for different people, but everybody has to make a choice. I mean, unless you're extremely athletic and metabolically flexible and able to switch back and forth between the two fuel sources very efficiently, then yeah, you've got to develop your diet in a way that's either helping you to burn fat or either helping you to burn carbohydrates. And you can feel good doing both. There's pros and cons to both. But most people that we see in practice have some kind of metabolic damage or inflammation or insulin resistance, and these people will feel a lot better burning fats for energy. Okay, well, if you're unsure which fuel you should choose, have a think about whether or not you're someone that experiences any of these symptoms. So if you're someone who's regularly lethargic or tired throughout the day, as if your body cannot access and use energy properly, you keep running out of energy shortly after eating, then you may have insulin resistance. If you are getting that hangry feeling before meals, you know, if you're the sort of person that you're in the middle of a work meeting and the clock is ticking towards 1 p.m., it's almost lunchtime, and you just cannot focus on the meeting because you are so hungry and so irritable, there might be some issues there in terms of your metabolism that need to be dealt with. If you're someone who's always on a weight loss diet, trying to lose weight, always exercising excessively, but always struggling with weight management, then it could mean you have some metabolic issues and you are insulin resistant. And if you're somebody who experiences pain, inflammation, gut stress, gut discomfort, sore joints, headaches, all of those signs of inflammation or stress in the body might mean that your body is actually using the wrong source of fuel. And it might mean that you have insulin resistance and you need to switch over to teaching your body to burn fats. So there are many, many benefits to burning fat that you will hear a lot about in this summit today. But some of the benefits include better energy levels and mental clarity, lower appetite, which allows you to have a sense of freedom from food because you're not always thinking about food. Burning fat does not necessarily mean weight loss, but it can help with weight loss. It can definitely help make weight loss a lot easier. Teaching your body to burn fat means your body isn't going to burn lean tissue, so it's a good way to preserve or build muscle mass. Burning fat can also help you to improve your cholesterol profile, so specifically lower levels of triglycerides, increased levels of healthy HDL cholesterol. As I said before, you know, if you're inflamed, it might mean that your body isn't burning the right type of energy, and it might mean your body isn't burning fat. And if you switch over to burning fat, that can help to reduce levels of inflammation and may help with things like chronic pain or headaches. And if you have type 1 diabetes and you're worried about developing insulin resistance, or you already do have insulin resistance, then teaching your body to actually switch over and burn fat for fuel as opposed to always riding a blood sugar roller coaster, it can decrease your requirement for insulin, you know, and this is true for people with type 1, without type 1. But I think with type 1 diabetes, you know, a lot of the solutions in terms of improving glycemic control are always orientated around having more insulin. But we do have issues of insulin resistance in people with type 1 diabetes and type 2, of course. And so reducing your body's requirements for insulin can be really, really beneficial for long-term glycemic control. And there's so many benefits to burning fat, so many that can't even be described on a piece of paper. You know, it's one of those things that when you teach your body to run on a different source of energy, every single cell in your body is using that new and improved source of energy, and it can lead to so many benefits. Okay, so as I alluded to, your body can only burn one source of fuel at a time. So if your goal is to burn fat, you have to identify the carbohydrates in your diet, pull those down, and then you have to increase your intake of healthy fats. And everybody who wants to burn fat needs to understand that it's going to be a combination of stored body fat that you have on your body and fat through the diet. Your body doesn't exclusively burn one or the other. So dietary fats are still very important, even if you feel that you're carrying excess weight on your body. Okay, so this is a graph that I like to show my clients who are wondering, whether or not they want to burn fat for fuel and wondering how they might do that. I mean, a lot of people at this summit will understand that if you want to burn fat, you have to lower carbs. But why? Why do we have to lower carbs? Well, this is kind of the reason. So this graph here shows the glucose response of the 3 different macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Now you can see that carbohydrates lead to the greatest increase in blood glucose levels. And it doesn't matter whether it's starchy carbohydrates from potato or bread, or sugary carbohydrates from sugary cereals or sugar in banana, for example. So all carbohydrates will break down to glucose and cause your blood glucose levels to peak way higher than they are at baseline. And when your body realizes that there's lots of extra sugar in the blood, it has a really unique way and a really effective way, to be honest, of dealing with that. And so your pancreas releases the hormone insulin. Now, when the pancreas releases insulin in adequate amounts, then blood glucose levels come back down because the glucose in the blood has now moved inside the cells. Inside the cells, the glucose is going to get used for energy or stored as fat. Beautiful. Now, this method of controlling our blood sugars is really, really important, really beneficial, because if we didn't have insulin to help put glucose into our cells would run out of energy, and also blood glucose would stay too high, and glucose can actually start damaging your tissues if it's too high in the blood for too long. So this is a great mechanism for controlling our blood sugar levels after eating carbohydrate. The problem, though, is that when we have insulin resistance, insulin doesn't come down straight away. So whenever blood glucose rises in someone with insulin resistance, now you've got very large amounts of insulin being released to deal with that glucose. And the pancreas will just pump out more and more and more insulin to deal with the glucose load if you are insulin resistant. And so what that means is, even once your blood sugars come back down to baseline, so at point number 2 here, insulin is still high. So insulin doesn't come down as quickly. That's still hanging out high levels in your body. And whenever insulin is high, your ability to burn fat is switched off. So we can see up here, when insulin is high, fat burning is locked. So you end up in a situation where your body's run out of glucose energy, but insulin's still high, so you can't switch over to burning fat. And you're in this sort of energy crisis at this point. Your body is either going to send you searching for another glucose hit, another source of carbohydrate, your next meal, or it's going to down-regulate your energy output. So your body conserves energy because it's worried about where its next source of energy is going to come from. Now, this causes a lot of people to sort of scratch their heads and go, but hang on, I've got so much energy stored on my body. Why can't my body just use that? And the reason is because high levels of insulin will absolutely block your body from even seeing the stored fat available. So your body really has no idea that it's even there. And it's not until many, many, many hours later, when those insulin levels finally come down, that the insulin concentration is low enough for your body to actually access that fat and see that fuel that is available. Now, on the flip side, you can see that fats have the least impact on your blood glucose levels and insulin levels. And obviously, different types of fats are going to have a different effect, but we'll talk about which sorts of fats I would recommend as healthy fats that can help to keep insulin levels nice and low. So you can see that if you lower the carbohydrates, you can lower the blood glucose response. And if you increase the fats, you can actually help your body to stay in this state here where insulin levels are low and you haven't peaked them so high that they're going to lock away your ability to burn fat. Now, everybody gets confused about protein because it has a moderate glucose load and a moderate requirement for insulin. But really, protein does not just turn to sugar in your blood. Protein contains amino acids that do increase your blood glucose levels slightly, but nowhere near as much as carbohydrate. And we do need some insulin to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So we don't want to see this moderate rise from protein as being a bad thing. Remember, protein is not really a fuel source. It's more like a building block that our body needs. I mean, you need amino acids from protein to actually burn energy. So you can see from this graph here that if we lower the carbohydrates, we eat the protein that we need, and then we increase our intake of fat, we're going to have more stable blood sugars and we're going to help our body burn fats for fuel. Okay, so when you're getting started on a low carb diet, you need to understand which foods actually contain carbohydrates. So you've probably all seen the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which is this sort of image here. Now, the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating is a way of helping people on a high carbohydrate diet formulate their plate. Now, carbohydrates are pretty much everywhere on this thing. You can see that in the orange section, you've got your pasta, your bread, your rice, your muesli, your couscous, your noodles. These wheat or grain-based foods are very high in starches. In the green section, we have our vegetables, and vegetables are pretty much all carbohydrates. I mean, plant foods are carbohydrates, but you've got some vegetables which are very high in starch, and then you've got some vegetables which are quite low in starch, and we would call them low density carbohydrates. And then in the fruit section, same sort of thing. I mean, you've got natural sugar here called fructose, which is a type of carbohydrate. And you've got some sugars that are low in fructose, some fruits that are low in fructose and some fruits that are higher in fructose. And then in the dairy section here, you've got things like cheese and milk and yogurt and milk alternatives as well for people who don't have dairy. And some of these foods will have added carbohydrates like sugar or fruits perhaps to flavor them. And then some of these foods will have natural carbohydrates, which would be like the lactose in the milk, for example. In the protein section over here, we've got our seafood, fish, eggs, meat, that sort of thing. Most of these foods are quite low in carbohydrate. However, the vegetarian options, which are like your legumes, nuts, and seeds, they do definitely contain some carbohydrates. And then what you're not seeing on this healthy guide to healthy eating, is all of the other supermarket processed packaged foods, all of those things like your muffins and pastries and cookies and cakes and ice cream and lollies, and all of those things that most people can understand tend to have lots of sugar or refined carbohydrates or refined oils. And I think most people can agree that those foods aren't really optimal choices for anyone's diet. Okay, so how much carbohydrate then? So we've just identified which foods contain carbohydrate. Does that mean we have to cut them all out and we can never eat another vegetable again? No, not necessarily. So there's kind of different forms of diet or different classes of diet based on carbohydrate content. You can see over here on the left, we've got our high carb diet. This is like the standard recommendation or the standard advice, which is 45 to 65% of energy in the diet from carbohydrates. Then we've got our moderate carb diet, might be known as like a balanced diet, where you've got equal amounts of carbs, fats, and proteins. This might also be called a low carb diet in some instances, but I definitely wouldn't call this a low carb diet. A true low carbohydrate diet tends to be classed as less than 26% of energy from carbohydrate. So basically, about a quarter or less of your energy in your diet is actually coming from carbohydrate foods. And then within that classification from 0 to 26% energy, there's lots of different types of low carbohydrate diets. So these are the diets we classify as true low carb diets. And these are really the diets that we're talking about in this sort of community and in this lot of presentations today. So this is the research paper that formed the first project of my PhD. And basically what we were trying to do here is analyze the methods of the effective and safe low carb diet studies that have been used in type 2 diabetes to really understand how we can develop low carb diets in clinical practice and in other research studies that are based on the evidence. Because what I find is there is a bit of a disconnect between the scientific literature and clinical practice. So this paper was really to help push the scientific literature into practice. And this paper was published in Diabetes, Obesity and Metabolism in 2019, and it was in the top 10% most downloaded papers for that year. So that's really, really good. We got such good feedback about this research. The main outcome from our study was that no one standard approach for developing low carb diet interventions exists, and a range of approaches have been identified as safe and effective. And I think that just comes back to personalized nutrition. And just because you might see someone doing a low carb diet one way online or on a Facebook group or one of your friends talking to you about it, it doesn't mean that's the way you have to do your low carb diet. So we really have to acknowledge that there's so many ways a low carb diet can be constructed for different people, and all those different methods can still be effective. Now, what I like to help my clients with is understanding what your health goals are and what outcomes you're going to use to track to help you move forward towards those goals. Because at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what type of low carb diet you choose to follow or what level of carbohydrates you choose to adhere to, as long as you are moving closer towards your health goals and as long as you are feeling good and healthy. And so I think it's really important to understand that people come to low carbohydrate nutrition for many different reasons. And we all have our own health goals, and we're constantly reviewing, analyzing, and updating these goals. And so we have to constantly ask ourselves, is our diet working for us? You know, does our diet need to be tweaked and adjusted? And that's why I love working with individuals, because we always go back and forth and always look at improving the diet and adapting the diet to suit them and to ensure that the diet that they are following is helping them to improve their outcomes and move closer to their health goals. So in other words, figure out what your why is, figure out what outcomes you're going to track, and then develop a diet that's going to help you get there. So how low do you go when it comes to carbohydrates? Now, if your diet has lots of these foods like your cheese and your olive oil and butter and meat and eggs and fish, you're going to find that there's not a lot of carbohydrates in these foods. So you can really have these foods quite freely without having to worry about the carbs shooting up too high. So if you were just eating foods that you can see on the screen, your carbohydrate intake would be around 10 grams per day or less than that. Now, if you're going to include some non-starchy green vegetables or things like cauliflower, if you're going to have some low sugar fruits like avocado or olives or cucumber, and if you're going to include some yogurt or maybe even some cheeses, then you might find that your carbohydrate intake is around 25 grams per day or less, which would still be classified as a very low carbohydrate diet. If you want to start including some orange foods, some red foods, give some color to your diet, then you could have carrots, capsicums, tomatoes, you could have strawberries, nuts, onions, pumpkins, and you would still have a very low carb diet as long as you were sort of moderating your portions of these sort of I don't want to call them higher carbohydrate foods because they are still all low carb foods, but we have to just acknowledge that these foods on the screen have carbohydrates. Now, you can have a decent portion of these foods and include the other foods that we saw previously and still stay within a carb intake of 20 to 50 grams a day. So 50 grams of carbs a day or less is classified as a very low carb diet. So, I mean, you can see there's still plenty of options of foods that can be consumed. What about these foods though? Now, this is the question, like these are the foods that people always question me about. Can I have apples? Can I have crackers? Can I have milk? Can I have chocolate? Can I have fruit? You know, this is what people really want to know, because some people do really want to include small amounts of these foods in their diet, and this will help them actually adhere to the diet and sustain it. So I would call those people carbohydrate moderators. They're the sort of people that can have 2 squares of chocolate, not think about it again, be really satisfied and move on. Whereas many of my patients are actually abstainers to carbohydrate food. So if they were to have 2 squares of chocolate, they wouldn't be able to stop thinking about the chocolate, and then they would want to have more and more and more. So you do have to figure out where you are in your journey and whether or not you can moderate carbohydrates. Me personally, when I started a low carb diet, I think it was 7, 8, 9 years ago, I could not moderate these types of foods. I would overdo it. I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about them. So I had to just stick with the very low carb diet foods so that I could eat them in excess without my carbohydrates being kicked up too high. But I think it's important to acknowledge that some people do really well with moderation, and you can include these foods and they can be perfectly healthy foods for you. And you can stay within a carbohydrate intake of 75 to 130 grams a day. It's still classified as a true low carb diet. Your progress might not be as fast as if you were to restrict your carbohydrates further. But if this allows you to sustain the diet for longer and adhere to the diet better, then it's still going to be effective long term. Now, I want to talk about building a low carb meal, because this is pretty much where I start for every single patient. I mean, it's important to understand what a low carb diet looks like and different amounts of carbs that can be considered a low carb diet. But in all honesty, I don't really promote counting your carbohydrates or rigidly trying to stick to a certain window of carb intake, especially not when you're getting started. I think the best thing to do is follow these principles of building a low carb meal, and don't stress so much about the carb content of your diet. Because if you're following these principles and you're sticking to the right types of foods, you'll find that it naturally helps you to fall into a window of low carb intake. So the first thing to prioritize when building a meal, a low carb meal, really, if you're building any meal, this should be the first thing to prioritize, but it's pick a protein. So proteins are our building blocks. They form our muscles, connective tissue, enzymes, hormones, bones. Pretty much everything that you can touch in your body is made of proteins. And our body is constantly turning over protein every single day. And it's these foods that are the most nutrient dense. So they have the most vitamins and minerals. And so you want to make sure that there's at least a third of your plate filled with protein foods. Now, the protein foods that I tend to recommend are consistent with the protein foods that were recommended in the studies that we looked at in my research project. And that's these sort of proteins here. So you've got your animal proteins, your meat, your fish, your eggs. You do have some processed meats on there, but we sort of aim for people to look at the ingredients list and choose the most minimally processed meat possible. And then we also would recommend organ meats for micronutrients. Protein powders are okay, just about sourcing the right types of protein powders. And then you've got things like your eggs, your low sugar dairy, which would be plain yogurt, cheese, and then also nuts and seeds. On the right side here, you can see there's some options for people who might be following a vegetarian diet. I really do not promote a vegan low carb diet. As you can see, there aren't many options for people on a vegan diet. And it's just not nutritionally adequate. So it's not something that I would promote or recommend, because micronutrient adequacy is very, very important on any diet, but it's even more important on a low carb diet because we're not really eating things like breads and cereals that have been fortified with nutrients. So it's even more important that we come to these animal-based proteins so that we can get our nutrients in. So these are the foods you're prioritizing at meals. You don't have to have just one source of protein. You might mix and match. You might have a bit of a variety. And you do want to kind of fill about a third of your plate with protein. Some people need more than that. So listen to hunger and satiety, or speak to a healthcare practitioner who can guide you further. Step number 2 is to choose a fat. So this one is a little bit controversial, and I think that our love for fat kind of ebbs and flows. You know, sometimes people are like, yeah, it's great, eat lots of healthy fat. And then sometimes you hear people say, don't eat fat, it's really calorie dense. You know, you don't need to eat excessive amounts of fat. And I think what's important to understand is that I highly recommend people include healthy fats as part of their meal. I don't necessarily promote guzzling fat outside of meal times. For some people, it can be helpful to have some fat in their coffee, or to have some fatty desserts in place of sugary desserts. That's okay. But really, I prioritize building 3 solid meals a day, and in those meals, including some healthy fats. And that's because fats are your main source of energy when you go on a low carb diet. And you cannot go on a low fat, low carb diet. That would actually be quite dangerous. So you do want to include some healthy fat, whether it's from avocado or olive oil or butter or egg yolk or cream. And what I class as a healthy fat is really a fat that has been minimally processed, as close to its whole food form. And, you know, if you take something like butter, there's been a bit of mechanical processing involved. But then if you look at something like margarine, there's a lot more processing involved. There's chemicals, there's dyes, there's heat. So that's a really quick way to see, well, is it a healthy fat? Is it not? But here are the list of fats that they tend to recommend in low carb diet studies that I would also recommend in my practice. And again, I'm talking about adding these fats as part of a healthy meal. Some people have really high energy requirements and they need to eat more healthy fat to get energy in. I often find people coming into my clinic and they've been on low calorie diets for years and years and years, and they really struggle with the idea of eating more healthy fat. But I think it's so, so important to understand that eating fat in the context of a low carb diet where your insulin levels are nice and low can help your body to burn fats for energy. And I also find that most people are under consuming energy relative to their requirements. So that's why I encourage including more healthy fats. But then you also get people who might be eating too much food and too much energy, and they may need to discuss more appropriate portions. So that's why seeking individualized advice is key. And then step number 3, as you guessed it, is control your carbs. And I think the best and easiest way to control carbs is by just removing the high density carbohydrates and then eating as much as you want of the low density carbohydrates. Easy for me to say because I know what they are, but here is your list of low density carbohydrates. And this is not an exclusive list. There's certainly things that I've missed out, but I think it's nice to just keep it really simple when you're starting, see what sort of meals you can build from these sort of low density carbohydrates. And you don't have to make it complicated. You don't have to have this big colorful plate full of 10 different types of vegetables. You can keep it simple. You can just have some mushrooms cooked in butter, and that might be it as part of your protein and fat-rich meal. Or you might decide to do a bit of a roast with some roast pumpkin, carrot, onion, eggplant. You might add some herbs and spices. So there is actually quite a lot of options, and there's different ways you can construct your low carb diet. But I think every low carb diet should follow these principles of prioritizing protein, including healthy fats, and controlling your carbohydrates. You'll probably have noticed that on the list of foods that I was showing you before, we don't really have any processed low carb food products like low carb bread, low carb chocolate, low carb protein bars, low carb brownies. But that doesn't mean that those things can't be used in your low carb diet. There aren't actually any studies investigating the use of processed low carb foods in type 2 diabetes. So it's definitely some research that needs to be done. I think from a nutrient density perspective and a satiety perspective, you'll probably find you feel a lot better eating mostly whole foods on your diet, no matter whether it's low carb or high carb or whatever. But these products certainly play an important role, especially for people who might be time poor and they need some convenient options. And also some people really need to wean off sugary foods and wean off carbohydrate foods by replacing those foods with low carb alternatives. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Everyone has different pathways to getting to their low carb diet. Everybody's low carb diet looks different, as I've said 100 times already. So there is definitely a place for these foods. The only thing I'll say is that because they are more processed, they can sometimes lead to gut discomfort, they can lead to food cravings, and they may not help you move towards your goals. So you've really got to figure out, do these work for me or not? And if they do, absolutely include them as part of your low carb diet. Okay, so we're sort of reaching the end, and I just wanted to kind of add in something here about some support because, you know, no one's perfect and we're all constantly working on our diet. We're all constantly working on our health. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that. I think sometimes patients feel bad when they come into me with questions and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, I just can't figure it out. And I'm like, it's okay. We're not perfect. And I don't expect you to just get this all overnight. I don't expect you to change your diet tomorrow and be, you know, this shiny low carb diet that looks perfect and amazing. Because, you know, our life changes, our goals change, our priorities change. And I think it's important to get some regular support sort of to help guide you throughout your life. Now, I love podcasts. I think listening to podcasts is such a good way to get some support because there are some great podcasts out there. I even have a podcast. Tracy has an amazing podcast, and many people in this community have great podcast episodes where you can listen to other people who might be following a low carb diet or researchers that might be sharing their research around low carb diets and practitioners sharing their tips around low carb as well. And you can listen to that while you're in the car traveling to work, you're in the waiting room of a doctor's office, or you're on a walk. And it's just a great way to get free information that is really, really useful. I know I've learned a lot by listening to podcasts. In addition, dietitian support is critical because dietitians are really the only professionals who can actually help you assess your diet for nutritional adequacy. And I totally understand that not all dietitians support low carbohydrate diets, but that's why I've sort of built my team of Ellipse Health dietitians, because we are trained in using medical nutrition therapy and low carbohydrate nutrition to help people move forward towards their goals. And we can assess your diet for nutritional adequacy. We can identify what nutrients are your priorities, what you might be lacking, what you might be getting too much of, and then help you really personalize the approach to suit you. If you go onto my website, which is Ellipse Health, you can actually find some free resources on there. We've got some nutrition articles. We've got, I just wrote one recently about folate, vitamin B12. We have an article on fasting, and there's some videos on there too. So all the dietitians that work with me do offer individual consultations, both online and in person at our clinics. But otherwise, there's some free content for you on the website. And myself and Dr. Prayan Yoganathan have actually written an ebook all about getting started on low carb. So this is a very topical event. The ebook is only just being released now. So you can go to the website www.ellipsehealth.com.au and download your copy of the ebook. This is the contents here. It's really the why, the what, and the how of low carbohydrate diets. I spend so much time explaining low carb to people in my clinic, and I love talking about low carb diets. I love talking about nutrition in general, even if it doesn't have anything to do with low carb. And I want more people to be able to access this information, because I can only see a certain amount of people in a day and in a week. And so can Pran. And so we've kind of joined forces to actually get information out there to the wider audience in a sort of more convenient and accessible way. So if you're interested in downloading this ebook, I would highly recommend checking it out. Okay, well, that is it from me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions whatsoever. I really hope you enjoyed this presentation and enjoy the rest of the summit.